The air in the grand dining hall of the Hacienda de los Sombras felt thick, not with the aroma of the slow-cooked lamb, but with the suffocating weight of secrets that had been fermenting for years, much like the vintage wines in our family's cellar. I sat at the edge of my seat, my fingers tracing the cold silver of the heirloom fork, feeling the invisible eyes of the portraits on the wall watching my every move. My husband, Alejandro, squeezed my hand under the table, his grip a silent promise of protection. Yet I could feel the tremor in his palm. We were waiting for his brother, Mateo, to arrive with his new mystery woman, a woman he had claimed to love after only 3 months of knowing her. In our world, where lineage and the purity of the family name meant everything, such haste was not just suspicious, it was a declaration of war. Mateo had always been the storm to Alejandro's calm sea. Years ago, he had nearly destroyed the family when he was caught in a scandalous affair with Alejandro's former fiancée, a betrayal that had left scars across the Santoro legacy. But there was a darker layer to Mateo that even Alejandro didn't fully grasp. Since the day I married into this prestigious family, Mateo had looked at me not as a sister, but as a prize he had been denied. It started with whispered comments at the vineyard about how I was too vibrant for a man as dull as my husband. Then came the gifts, black lace veils and silk, garments that felt more like a brand than a gesture of kindness. I had kept these horrors silent, fearing that a single spark would burn down the entire Santoro estate. I had even resorted to blocking him on every digital platform after I realized he was tracking my movements through the GPS tags of my photos, knowing exactly which boutique in Madrid I had visited before I even returned home. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and there he was. Mateo walked in with a predatory grace, leading a woman named Beatrice by the hand. She was young, pale, and looked like a bird caught in a golden cage. But as the dinner progressed, I noticed someone else, a man standing in the shadows of the arched doorway. He was Diego, the family's new head of security, a man with eyes like flint, who seemed to be recording every micro-expression on Mateo's face. There was also the matriarch, Dona Isabella, who sat at the head of the table. She hadn't touched her food. She watched me with a cold, calculated intensity that made me realize Mateo wasn't the only one who had been observing me. The drama wasn't just about a brother's obsession. It was about a throne, a legacy, and the blood that would inevitably be spilled to keep it. The clinking of crystals shattered the uneasy silence. Mateo stood up, his smile not reaching his eyes as he raised a glass of our finest Gran Reserva. He turned his gaze toward me, ignoring his own fiancée as if she were a mere prop in his twisted theater. He began to speak of beauty and worth, claiming that his brother had been incredibly fortunate to marry a woman from such a humble, struggling background, as if I were a charity project the Santoros had rescued from the dust of the outskirts. His voice dripped with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. He then looked directly at Beatrice and loudly proclaimed that he had finally found a woman who eclipsed even the beauty of his brother's wife, a remark so pointed it felt like a physical strike. Alejandro's knuckles turned white as he gripped the table, but the true sting came next. Mateo laughed, a hollow, echoing sound, and mocked our engagement. He ridiculed the fact that Alejandro had proposed to me in the old library where we first met, calling it pathetic and cheap compared to the extravagant, diamond-studded spectacle he had arranged for Beatrice in Marbella. He claimed that Alejandro didn't know how to truly cherish a woman, implying that only he, Mateo, possessed the passion and wealth to do so. The table went cold. I looked at Dona Isabella, expecting her to reprimand him, but she simply took a slow sip of water, her eyes fixed on me with a terrifying neutrality. It was then I realized that this wasn't just Mateo being a playful rogue, as the cousins often claimed. This was a calculated attempt to destabilize our marriage, likely orchestrated to prove Alejandro's weakness in front of the family council. But I was done being the silent observer in my own tragedy. The 4 glasses of wine I had consumed didn't make me reckless. They made me brave. while Mateo leaned in to kiss. That an act that looked more like a demonstration of ownership than affection. I reached for my phone. For years, I had archived the madness. I had kept the midnight messages where he begged me to leave Alejandro, the photos of my own bedroom he had sent me from a burner account to show he could enter whenever he wished, and the chilling notes where he detailed his fantasies of Alejandro disappearing so we could rule the hacienda together. With a steady thumb, I uploaded the entire folder to the Santoro Legacy group chat, a digital space reserved for the most senior members of the clan. As the synchronized chimes of a dozen phones filled the room, the color vanished from Mateo's face, replaced by a gray mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The silence that followed, their cacophony of notification pings was more deafening than any scream. Mateo stood frozen, the wine glass still poised in midair, but his hand was shaking so violently that red droplets splashed onto the pristine white lace of Beatrice's sleeve. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the floor beneath him was made of glass and it was already shattering. Alejandro was the first to move. He didn't shout, which was far more terrifying. He stood up with a slow, agonizing deliberation, his eyes fixed on his brother with a look of profound, icy realization. He didn't look at me, and for a fleeting second a cold shiver ran down my spine. Was he angry at Mateo for the betrayal? Or at me for the public execution of the family's dignity? In the Santoro world, the only thing worse than a crime was the scandal of being caught. Donna Isabella finally moved. She didn't look at the phone that lay beside her plate, glowing with the evidence of her son's depravity. Instead, she stood up, her silk shawl draped over her shoulders like a shroud, and signaled to Diego. The head of security moved with the silence of a shadow, placing a firm, heavy hand on Mateo's shoulder. There was no struggle. Mateo seemed to collapse into himself, his bravado evaporating like mist in the Andalusian sun. He was led out of the hall, but as he passed me, he whispered something, not a plea for forgiveness, but a warning. He told me I had no idea what I had just invited into my life by opening that digital Pandora's box. Beatrice followed them, weeping silently, a ghost in a designer dress, leaving Alejandro and me alone in the wreckage of the dinner. The night didn't end there. Sleep was impossible. I retreated to the library, the only place where the scent of old leather and beeswax offered a semblance of comfort. But as I pulled a heavy volume of Spanish history from the shelf, a small weathered ledger fell out, and it wasn't a family record. It was a personal diary belonging to Alejandro's father, the late Don Carlos. As I flipped through the pages, the detective in mind, the one I had suppressed to be a perfect wife, began to piece together a horrifying puzzle. The Santoro fortune wasn't built on wine alone. There were entries about disposable assets and cleansing the bloodline that made no sense until I saw a name scribbled in the margins. Diego, the man I thought was just a bodyguard, had been a part of this family's shadow history for decades. And then I found the photo tucked into the back cover, a young Alejandro and Mateo standing next to a third boy whose face had been violently scratched out. The scratch marks on the photograph were deep, as if whoever did it wanted to erase the boy's very existence from the fabric of reality. I traced the jagged edges with my thumb, a cold dread settling in my gut. My thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the library door. I didn't turn around. I knew the scent of that particular tobacco anywhere. It was Diego. He didn't approach me like a servant would. He walked with an air of quiet authority that suggested he owned more of this house than any of the people sleeping in its bedrooms. He stood by the window, looking out over the moonlit vineyards, his silhouette sharp against the silver light. Without me saying a word, he remarked that curiosity in the hacienda de los Sombras was a luxury that few could afford, and fewer still survived. His voice was like gravel, low and devoid of emotion. He began to talk about the cleansing mentioned in the ledger, explaining that the Santoros had a long tradition of removing anyone who threatened the stability of the inheritance. He implied that the third boy in the photo, the one with the ruined face, was the true firstborn. A child born of a mistake that Don Carlos couldn't allow to tarnish the legacy. The boy had been sent away, erased from the records, and forgotten by everyone except the soil of the estate. Then, Diego turned to me, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. He told me that my little stunt with the group chat had done more than just embarrass Mateo. It had forced Dona Isabella's hand. By exposing Mateo's instability, I had unintentionally cleared the path for the rightful successor to take control. But that successor wasn't Alejandro. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me. Alejandro had always been the golden son, the stable one, the protector. But as Diego spoke, I realized that Alejandro had known about the tracking, the harassment, and the obsession all along. He had let it happen. He had let me suffer under Mateo's gaze because he needed a reason to cast his brother out without looking like the villain. I was the bait, a pawn in a game played by men who viewed women as either trophies or tools. But there was one more piece to the puzzle. Diego reached into his pocket and produced a small silver key identical to the one I wore around my neck, given to me by Alejandro on our first anniversary. He whispered that there was a reason we hadn't been able to conceive a child, a reason tied to the very wine we drank every night. The betrayal wasn't just digital, it was biological. But Alejandro hadn't accounted for Diego. Just as his hand was about to close around my arm, the head of security appeared from the darkness behind him. There was no struggle, no explosive fight, only the cold, metallic click of a firearm pressed against the base of Alejandro's skull. Diego looked at me, and for the first time, the flint in his eyes softened into something resembling recognition. He didn't speak to Alejandro. He spoke to the room, to the history buried in the tiles. He revealed that he was the boy from the photograph, the one with the scratched-out face. He wasn't a servant who had risen through the ranks. He was the firstborn Santoro, the mistake that had been discarded but never destroyed. He had returned to the Hacienda years ago, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the family to tear itself apart from the inside. The revelation hit Alejandro like a physical blow. The man who thought he was the ultimate grandmaster of this game realized he was just another piece on a much larger board. Diego explained that Dona Isabella knew exactly who he was. She had allowed him to stay, using him as her personal shadow to keep her sons in check, promising him that the one who proved the strongest or the most ruthless would eventually inherit the title. But Diego had his own agenda. He wasn't interested in the Santoro name. He wanted to dismantle the legacy that had tried to erase him. He had been the one to leave the ledger for me to find, the one to guide me to the laboratory. He needed a witness, someone who wasn't blinded by the family's bloodlust, to expose the truth to the authorities and end the Santoro reign forever. I stood between the two brothers, the legal heir who had poisoned my life and the forgotten ghost who wanted to burn it all down. The air was electric with a decade of resentment. Outside, the bells of the estate's chapel began to toll, signaling the arrival of the local Guardia Civil. I realized then that Beatriz, the fragile bird Mateo had brought to dinner, was actually Diego's accomplice, an undercover investigator who had been gathering evidence alongside him. The entire evening had been a trap, not just for Mateo, but for the entire Santoro structure. As the sirens wailed in the distance, I looked at the silver key in my hand and threw it into the dark corners of the cellar. I wasn't going to be anyone's pawn anymore. I walked past the two men, past the secrets and the poison, toward the light of the Andalusian dawn, knowing that while the Hacienda de las Sombras would fall, I would be the only one to walk away from its ruins truly free. 6 months have passed since the dust of the Guardia Civil's cars settled on the long, winding road leading away from the Hacienda de las Sombras. I am sitting now on a balcony overlooking the Atlantic in a small, nameless village in Galicia, where the air is salted by the ocean and carries no scent of fermenting grapes or ancient lies. My name is different now and my life is my own. The news from the south reaches me in fragments like shards of a broken mirror. The Santoro Empire didn't just fall. It imploded. The laboratory in the cellar, once a site of clinical betrayal, became the centerpiece of a national scandal that stripped the family of its prestige and its fortune. Alejandro is currently awaiting trial in a high-security facility in Seville. His lawyers struggling to explain the systematic poisoning of his spouse and the biological optimization projects found in Don Carlos's ledgers. Without the protection of his name, he looks like what he always was, a small man hiding behind a grand legacy. Donna Isabella passed away shortly after the arrests. Her harder, whatever organ occupied its place, finally giving out as she watched the family's dirty laundry aired on every television screen in Spain. They say she died in the grand dining hall, staring at the empty chair where the firstborn should have sat. As for Diego, he vanished as quickly as he had appeared. He didn't want the inheritance, and he didn't want the fame. He had spent a lifetime as a scratch on a photograph. And once he had erased the men who had erased him, he chose to become a ghost again. I received a package a month ago with no return address. Inside was a small, dried vine leaf and a photo of the three brothers Alejandro, Mateo, and Diego, but this time, the third boy's face was restored. A digital reconstruction that showed a child with eyes full of hope. It was a silent goodbye from a man who had used me as a catalyst for his revenge, but who had also, in his own dark way, set me free. Beatrice, the woman I once pitied as a victim, is now a lead witness for the prosecution. It turns out her clumsiness and tears were a masterclass in undercover work. She was never Mateo's fiancée. She was a specialist in pharmaceutical crimes who had been tracking the Santoros' illicit chemical imports for years. We spoke once on the phone before the trial began. She didn't apologize for using me as part of the sting, and I didn't ask her to. In the world of the Hacienda, everyone was a player, and I was simply the only one who didn't know the rules until the final hand was dealt. Now, I watched the sun set over the horizon, far from the shadows of the vineyard. The silver key is at the bottom of a ravine, and the poison is out of my system. For the first time in my life, I don't look over my shoulder. The Santoro story is over, and mine is just beginning.